Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew Loney to Lector. The conference will run for about 45 minutes. Afterwards, there will be about 20 minutes for questions. Frederick Forsyth recently said of Andrew's book that it's a remarkable and definite portrait of the truly ghastly spy and traitor Guy Burgess, who surely should never have been permitted to do us so much damage, and a portrait of the snobbery and laxity that permitted an old Etonian who had changed sides to get away with it for so long. Are there any redeeming features to Guy Burgess? Well, as today is actually St. Guy's Day, maybe we can try and find some. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you very much for coming today. And thank you, Karen, for organising this. She's been really, she's my sort of person in France, my person on earth here. And it's very nice to be back in this part of the world. I came last year to teach on a writing course. I have another job as a literary agent. And I fell in love with the area, so I can quite understand why you all want to live here. I'm very tempted to come and live here myself. And I'm very pleased to be back again this week to do another of the writing courses with Karen this week, a chapter away. My last subject was a man called John Buchan, who's a very dour Scotsman, and people said, I can quite understand why you could identify with him. But how can you identify with Guy Burgess? After all, he's gay, he's a communist, he's intelligent, he's charming, and I point to this picture here and I say, well, we have exactly the same hairstyle. This is the background to this picture is quite interesting. One of the advantages of taking 30 years over a book is that sometimes people tell you different things 30 years after we first interviewed them. And I went in the 1980s and interviewed Sir Stephen Runciman, who had taught Burgess at Cambridge. And Runciman claimed to me that he'd hardly knew Burgess, he'd only taught him on a few occasions. And I took him at his word. And then, a few years ago, as the agent for the Runciman estate, I was staying at his home in the Borders, and mentioned I was doing this book on Burgess, and his niece said to me, oh, you must come and see the photo albums. They were lovers for 3 years. And so this is one of the pictures when Burgess went to stay on the Isle of Egg, which was owned by the Runciman family. So what I'm going to do over in fact not next 45 minutes, but actually the next 3.5 hours, is to take you for a whistle-stop tour through the life of Guy Burgess. And we begin here at this house in Devonport, where he was born in April 1911. His father was a naval officer, was often away from home. He was very much brought up by his mother, who was a very strong-willed woman, and by a group of governesses. It was very much an all-female environment. This is his father, a man called Malcolm Burgess, who had not a particularly distinguished career in the Navy. He'd been at Dartmouth. He spent, according to his son, this First World War hunting U-boats in the North Sea. In reality, he was servicing craft on Tyneside. He was a maintenance expert. So one of many fantasies his son was beginning to weave from a very early age. This is his mother, a much more important figure in the story, Eve. She was half Canadian. Her father was a very successful banker who eventually sold the family bank to Lloyd's. And there was always money in the family. Even when Burgess was in Moscow, he had his trust fund money sent out to him. This is where they moved from Devonport. This is a house called West Lodge in Westmeath, just outside Portsmouth, where they moved in the early 1920s. Burgess and his younger brother Nigel, who was 2 years younger, were brought up by governesses. And then this is his father, Malcolm, just before he retired from the Navy in 1922 as commander. And then Burgess, as was customary for children of his background at that time, was sent away to a prep school called Lockers Park. Lockers Park was then the most expensive and fashionable prep school in Britain. It had just educated Lord Louis Mountbatten. It had a very strong naval tradition. Lord Beattie's son was contemporary of his. Tom Mitford, the brother of the Mitford girls, James Lees Milne, the whole series of quite well-known people were at Lockers Park. What I love about Lockers Park is they divided their houses into colours. Can you guess which colour House Burgess was in? Red, yeah. Even a red, even then. He proved to be a model schoolboy. Here he is, you can see circled. He's in the first 11 football. People always imagined that he was a very sort of unsporty figure. And it's true that once he left university, he really did no sport because he'd been told it was very bad for your health. But until then, he was an extremely good football player and swimmer. He was a very bright child. He was top of his class pretty much all the way through Lockers Park. And because he was too young to go on to Dartmouth, which had an entry age of 13 and a half, he was sent off briefly after Lockers Park to Eton. This is a picture of this house at Eton. And it was at Eton in his third term that a family tragedy befell them. According to Burgess, he was woken one night by anguish cries from his parents' bedroom. He ran next door to find his father dead. He died in the course of making love to his mother, and the young 13-year-old had to prise the two bodies apart. And he always said that this was what shaped both his devotion to his mother and his sexuality. Well, it's a great story, and his brother Nigel was amazed when I told it to him. And I talked to a psychiatrist who said that this, I think it's called creation theory, anyway, he's creating all these stories from a very early age. Now, in most families, if your father has just died and you were 13 years old, you probably would leave them in the school they're in, but this is not a normal family, and Burgess is sent a few weeks later, as prescribed, to Dartmouth Naval College, which is a very, very different environment to Eton. Instead of learning Latin and Greek, he's learning seamanship and knots. He's in a military uniform, you can see him there circled, and he's subject to naval discipline, taught by naval officers, running everywhere, and it's a very, very harsh regime. But Burgess is extremely chameleon. He's very good at adapting to his surroundings, and here again, he adapts. He's not happy, he's very lonely, he feels very isolated, but he manages to shine. He comes top of his term, this is the term here, and everyone says that he's headed for a glittering naval career. He will be the first their term to achieve flag rank. But in fact, in the summer of 1927, he leaves Dartmouth very quickly and under very mysterious circumstances. There are rumours that he's been caught in some homosexual scandal, others that he's been caught stealing, shades of the Winslow boy. The official excuse is that his eyesight isn't sufficiently good for him to be a naval officer. And I think actually that is the real reason he left. The fact is his eyesight wasn't very good. He was really the wrong boy for this sort of school. Far too academic to be suitable. And so in the autumn of 1927, he goes back to Eton. This is his housemaster, a man with a moustache next to the cups, called Frank Dobbs, who was to remain friendly with even when he went to Moscow in the 1950s. We don't think of Burgess as a corporal in the OTC. Here he is on exercise in Windsor Great Park in 1927. Here he is in the first 11 football. And this is one other slight diversion from his time at Eton. This is a picture of his mother and her new husband, a man called Jack Bassett. And Jack Bassett had a very interesting background. He'd been an army officer, he'd served with Lawrence of Arabia in the Arab Revolt, and indeed had one of the early copies of Seven Pillars of Wisdom. But he and Burgess really didn't get on. Burgess called him the Colonel, and he would do anything to annoy the Colonel. And the worst thing you could do for the Colonel was to pass the fort the wrong way. This is again a picture of him in sixth form at Eton. He's again head of top of his year. But the one thing that he really wants, though despite getting all these glittering prizes, is he wants to be accepted. He wants to be part of something called POP, which is a group of self-elected prefects at Eton. Now, the people who are elected into POP tend to be the children of aristocrats and the captain of cricket. They do not tend to be the sons of naval officers who are good at history. And there was really no reason why Burgess should ever have been selected for POP, but he tried 8 times in 3 terms. And for those who've seen Julian Mitchell's play Another Country, and the story of how Guy Bennett becomes disengaged and becomes very anti-establishment because of his school days, that is based on the story of Guy Burgess. We also have Guy getting much more radicalised this time. He comes under the influence of a history teacher called Robert Burley, known as Red Robert, who is really very much just centre-left. But Burgess becomes involved in the political society and also in the debating society. And you can begin to trace, and this is one of the great advantages of biography, begin to trace how his views, in a sense, move to the left, just as he becomes alienated from, in a sense, the establishment. Here he is as a prefect in his house. It's the one in the middle. And here he is on the 4th of June, which is this sort of Eton speech day. You can just, it's not a very good photo, I'm afraid, but the most important lever is riding a boat called Monarch. And here he is. And from Eton, he won a major open history scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge. And for those who don't know Cambridge, Trinity is the richest of the Cambridge colleges. It's the largest, and it likes to think it's the grandest. They always claim that God had been a Trinity man. And it's here he lives in the Great Court for his first year. He gets involved in acting. One of his great friends is Michael Redgrave. He gets a first at the end of his exams at the end of the year. But he does a lot of punting. Here he is with a boyfriend of his at the time, a fellow communist who later became a Conservative MP, as a lot of them did. What I should say is, if there's a man in the picture here with Guy Burgess who was not related to him, then he was one of his lovers, okay? It will just save me a bit of time. And these are some pictures taken by Lettice Ramsey at the time. You can see he's a very good-looking, rather thoughtful character. Film star looks, regarded as the most brilliant undergraduate of his generation. I love this picture, it sums him up perfectly. Someone else doing the work while he sits there relaxing. This is him on the Isle of Egg, on one of these holidays with Stephen Runciman, and the man below him is his history tutor, Everett Outram. And this is a punting expedition in June 1932. He's just got a first in his Part 1s. This is his boyfriend at the time, a man called Jack Hunter, who later became a very successful scriptwriter in Hollywood. Jack Hunter claimed to be the illegitimate son of Douglas Fairbanks, and I thought, oh God, not another fantasist. He was the illegitimate son of Douglas Fairbanks. And some more pictures of this picnic. These were given to me by someone who was actually on that picnic. And this is where again the story changes. I don't know if you recognize this group of individuals. This is probably the most well-known secret society in the world, the Apostles. A group of intellectuals, mainly chosen from Trinity and King's, very strong links to Bloomsbury. People like Maynard Keynes and Ian Forster were members. And Burgess was elected a member of the Apostles in 1932, chosen by his friend, Anthony Blunt, you'll see there on the bottom left, who at the time was the boyfriend of the man standing diametrically opposite him, Julian Bell, part of the Bloomsbury group. And the Apostles were to be a very important formative experience. He used it later as a very important networking tool. But the Apostles also felt they had a whole series of different loyalties. They didn't have loyalties to individuals. They didn't feel they had loyalties to the state. They had them to truth and to purity. And a lot of them were gay. And of course, at this time, homosexuality was illegal. And one of their arguments was that if they felt criminalized by society, if society wasn't able to recognize them because of their sexuality, they didn't feel they had any allegiance to society. And the Russians, when they came to penetrate the British establishment and send in sleepers, one of the organizations that they penetrated was the Apostles. Because you can see they were very attractive in some ways to them. Highly able people with a different series of allegiances. Cambridge by 1932-1933 became very politicized. We'd had the national government, we'd seen the rise of fascism, a sense amongst the younger generation that the only bulwark against communism, against fascism was going to be communism. This is a famous moment in Cambridge history, the Armistice Day March in 1933. You may recognize Donald Maclean, just under the R of war there. And Maclean, Philby and Burgess were very active in Cambridge University Social Society, which were the communists. Burgess was on this march, but he didn't walk, he went by car, which was sort of his want. And when the Hunger Marchers came to Cambridge, and as a mark of solidarity, the Cambridge undergraduates walked with them down to Hyde Park, Burgess took the train and then joined them in Hyde Park. Kim Philby had been reading history in the year above Burgess at Trinity. He had left in 1932 and gone to Vienna, where he'd become involved in the communist underground there. He met a woman called Litzy Friedman, who by chance turned out to be a Russian agent. And she recruited him, in effect, as the first of the Cambridge spies. And he was sent back to find other possible recruits who could be sent in as sleepers into the British establishment and activated many years later. And he went back to Cambridge with a list of 7 names. We know that the top of the list was Donald Maclean, and we know that number 7 was Guy Burgess. We have no idea who numbers 2 to 6 were, whether they were recruited and never discovered, or whether they would turn down the approach. Donald Maclean was very happy to join up with it. Everyone was a little bit concerned about Burgess because he was so indiscreet, they thought he really wouldn't make a good spy. But he had actually cottoned on to what was going on, he realized what was happening, and he badgered Philby and Maclean to let him join. And so rather than being recruited, you can say he thrust himself upon the Russian intelligence service. Here he is again with his Conservative MP friend. about the time he was recruited. And this is a picture of Donald Maclean again about the time he was recruited. All of them were brilliant, all of them had got firsts, and were heading into very successful careers. One of the reasons I think that Burgess was susceptible to recruitment at the end of 1935 or end of 34, beginning of 35, was that up till then his career had been predicated on two things. One was his intellectual, his academic career, and the other was his political interests. And though he hadn't actually taken a degree, he'd had a nervous breakdown in his Part 2s and had to be taken out of the exam room. He was allowed to stay on at Trinity and do a PhD. He actually taught undergraduates. One of the undergraduates at Trinity that he coached, in fact, to get into the Foreign Office, was a man called Milo Talbot, who 20 years later would be the man as head of the Foreign Office Security Department who would be in charge, responsible for investigating him. So if he hadn't coached him so well, history might have been slightly different there. But Burgess had discovered that someone else was doing a PhD on the same subject, and he had really lost heart, and he had abandoned his academic career. He was lost, he was looking for some sort of validation, some sort of purpose in life, and it was at this point that the Russians swooped on him. The recruitment process was extremely sophisticated. It was a very gradual process of drawing people in to work towards world peace. And they really took the role of the absent father with all the Cambridge spies. All of them had absent fathers. Philby's father was abroad. Both Blunt and Maclean's fathers had died when they were either at university or teenagers. The first of Burgess's recruits was Anthony Blunt, a tutor at Trinity. This is a picture of Blunt on a ship to Russia. The second of his recruits, often known as the fifth man, is a man called John Cairncross, who just passed first into the Foreign Office, another modern language graduate at Trinity. When we talk about the Cambridge Five, we should really be talking about the Cambridge 50. There were many, many more people involved in the gang at different levels. We know some of the names, some of them are confessed, people like Leo Long and others. Others we don't know, we just know their code names, people like Attila, Professor, Chauffeur, Poet. This is the Oxford side of the ring, a man called Gorombi Rees. Burgess was also recruited in Oxford. He spent a lot of time in Oxford. Rees was a fellow at All Souls and was a journalist. He was involved with The Spectator. And they would become firm friends. Gorombi Rees' son would be one of Burgess's godchildren. There's some speculation about the Oxford Ring, and there are two theories. One is that the Oxford Ring were so successful that they were never caught, and the other, they were so useless they never got anywhere. So you just pick your version. This is Michael Straight, the American side of the spy ring, who was almost about to become president of the Union and was decided to go back to the States and to penetrate the State Department. And this was the man that they knew as Otto. His real name was Arnold Deutsch, and he was one of the main handlers of the Cambridge spies in the mid-1930s. He was a very interesting man. He had a PhD from Vienna University in chemistry. He spoke 6 languages, and he was doing postgraduate work as an illegal at the University of London. And he was helped by this man called Theodore Mali, who had the very interesting background of being both a priest and a cavalry officer. And they were the two of the original handlers. This is the third most important handler, a man called Yuri Moden, who's only just died, and I interviewed for the book, and who ran Burgess just after and the rest of the gang just after the Second World War. Burgess came down from Cambridge at the beginning of 1935. He set himself up as a freelance journalist, and also went to work for this man called Jack McNamara, one of his enemies, who was very involved with far-right groups. He was the MP for Chelmsford and very active in something called the Anglo-German Fellowship and the Anglo-German Club. And Burgess had been tasked by the Russians to find out what was happening in terms of German politics, and also, of course, their worry about appeasement, that Britain would come to some arrangement with Nazi Germany. Another lover, another great mentor at this time was Harold Nicholson. Nicholson's son had been eaten with Burgess, but that didn't prevent the two becoming lovers. And Nicholson was to prove a very important figure in Burgess's life and continue writing to him right up to his death. In 1936, Burgess achieved his ambition of getting into the BBC. This was one of the Russian targets. They thought it was a very important place for them to network and also as an agent of influence. This picture has a slight history from the which we can follow in the rather agonized correspondence in the BBC archives. This is, I think, the 6th picture that Burgess produced, having produced several of himself on the sands at Margate, which were not regarded as suitable official photographs. It was at the BBC he met a man called David Footman, who was a broadcaster but was also an MI6 agent. And Footman recruited him to work for Section D of MI6. And he was recruited really because of his friendship with this lovely looking man here called Edward Pfeiffer. Edward Pfeiffer had the rather unique distinction of being the head of the French scouting movement and a well-known French sadomasochist. He was also the secretary to Daladier, the French Minister of War and later Prime Minister. And it was through these homosexual networks that he'd met Burgess, and Burgess was recruited to work for these two men here. Do you recognise either of them? The thin man is Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister, and the other is a very secretive figure called Joseph Ball. Joseph Ball was behind the Zinoviev letter, and he was, in a sense, the secret spy chief. He worked ostensibly for the Conservative Central Office, but was in fact head of Churchill's private spy organisation. And Burgess joined this in 1936-37, and as basically an emissary to Daladier. Burgess continued to work in intelligence, British intelligence. In 1939, he was seconded to a secret organisation called the Joint Broadcasting Committee, whose role was to broadcast black propaganda into Nazi Germany. He set up transmitters in places like Luxembourg. He spent a lot of time in Switzerland. He then moved on as an ideas man within MI6, and one of his ideas was set up something called Guy Fawkes College. And the idea was to recruit agents to be parachuted into occupied Europe. Well, at this time the war had begun, and to basically wreak havoc. So this is the precursor of SOE. And Burgess was sent off to be an instructor at this college, Brickenbury, which is just outside Hertford, and he brought in an old friend of his, Kim Philby, who he brought into MI6. And so the two of them became instructors at the school in the summer of 1940. Now, Philby, of course, carried on within MI6 and almost rose to the top of it. Burgess's days in MI6, I'm afraid, were numbered. A few weeks after he was there, he was kicked out for, in the words of someone, messing about with a corporal. But Burgess was a great survivor, and within weeks he had got himself recruited as an MI5 agent, working for this man called Kemble Johnson, a contemporary of his at Cambridge, and also Anthony Blunt. Anthony Blunt had joined MI5 in the summer of 1940. On one day he received two letters, one from the War Office saying, "We know you are a communist at university and we do not want you working for MI5, and the other from the War Office saying, "We would be delighted if you could join us on Monday." So of course he took the second letter. Burgess's job in MI5 was to run two agents. One was this man called Eric Kessler here, who was a Swiss diplomat and journalist, who reported on the neutrals and peace negotiations, and he was another of his lovers and another Russian spy. And the other was this man called Andrei Revay, who was a Hungarian journalist who reported on the exile groups in London, who after the war was quite a well-known picture gallery owner. He was a great champion of Graham Sutherland. And just running through again some of the characters that Burgess was coming across. This is a man called Guy Liddell, who was the deputy director of MI5 during the war, a great friend of Burgess. They used to go to the music hall together every Monday. And Liddell, whose wife had left at the beginning of the war, was a very lonely man and would confide in Burgess and confide a lot of secrets about agents and personalities and operations. And the other man he became very friendly with is this man called Dick White, who would be later head of both MI5 and MI6. So you can imagine that when the bubble burst in 1951, it was quite a shock because a lot of these people felt a sense of personal betrayal. They'd worked alongside Burgess and trusted him with all sorts of secrets, and then discovered they'd gone to the Russians. Here's another member of the Apostles, another member of Trinity, Victor Rothschild. Burgess and Blunt rented his flat in London during the war, together with a woman who would eventually become Rothschild's wife, Tess Mayer. Rothschild has a very interesting role in the whole story. There have been big questions exactly how involved he was in spy ring. I think he certainly knew far more than he claimed. It's interesting that the interviews with Victor Rothschild have never been, that MI5 did, have never been released. And I think there's some suggestion that if Victor Rothschild wasn't involved, certainly his wife Tess was. And one of the things that Burgess had over Rothschild was that he'd been in the car, same car, when Rothschild, driving from Cambridge to London, had killed someone. He'd been brought up on charges of manslaughter. Through a clever lawyer, he'd actually managed to get himself off. But it gave Burgess a hold over Rothschild for the rest of his life. And if you remember, it was Rothschild who was the man who paid Peter Wright to write Spycatcher, a book which, interestingly enough, has no mention of Victor Rothschild in it whatsoever. This is another of Burgess's lovers at the time, a man called James Pope Hennessy, quite a well-known writer at the time, who was involved in a ménage à trois with this woman here, Clarissa Churchill, still alive, aged 95, the wife of Anthony Eden and the niece of Winston Churchill. And Burgess had been told to get close to her by the Russians. When I interviewed Clarissa Churchill, again she claimed that she hardly knew Burgess. She'd met him a couple of times. Now I knew from talking to people that the two of them had actually been engaged. Now, though Burgess did have a habit of getting engaged to people without telling them, I have to say this was not one of those occasions. Another of his girlfriends at this time was a woman called Rosamund Lehman, who's quite a well-known writer, and he used to go and stay with her at her house in Ipswich outside Oxfordshire until he tried to seduce her gardener. And that was the end of a beautiful friendship, because she argued it was a lot harder to get gardeners than to have friends. Burgess, having continued to work for intelligence during the war, also continued at the BBC. He ran a programme called The Week in Westminster, which gave him incredibly good contacts with politicians and journalists. And at the end of the war, one of those journalists was elected as a Labour MP and as Minister of State in the Foreign Office. Hector McNeill, who's the man just to the left of Bevan there. He was number 2 to Bevan. And he decided that, as well as having a Foreign Office private secretary, he wanted his own private secretary, in effect a special advisor. And he wanted Guy Burgess. So the Russians suddenly found themselves with an agent right in the heart of the Foreign Office, seeing all the papers, everything from MI6 telegrams to Chief of Defence Staff meeting minutes to cabinet minutes, found Burgess right at the centre there. And of course Burgess took great advantage of this. He very kindly said that he would work late, he would work weekends, he would take documents home. Some 5,000 documents found themselves on their way to the Russian intelligence services in this period. And so important was he that often during the four-power conferences, the Russian negotiating team knew the British position before the British knew it themselves. So Burgess was now in the Foreign Office, and under the mentorship of Hector McNeill, he was now part of the Foreign Office establishment. This is a cartoon he drew. He's a very good cartoonist during the Berlin airlift, where Hector is summoned back for a cabinet meeting. This is Burgess going down to pick him up down on the Solent. But Burgess really knew everything that was going on. And because Hector McNeill was a rather lazy man, Burgess knew more than perhaps a lot of private secretaries at the time. This is a slight digression. This is the house of his mother, Oakhurst, near Newbury, in the 1940s. Had 17 acres, an ornamental lake, a butler. So it gives us some idea of the family wealth. Anyway, Burgess managed to cut his way through the Foreign Office. He was seconded to a secret unit called the Information Research Department, which again dealt with black propaganda, which he immediately betrayed to the Russians. He was sent to the Forest Department, where he helped shape British policy towards recognizing Red China, at a time, of course, when America didn't. And he became the resident expert on communism in the Foreign Office. Indeed, he was the principal lecturer every year at the Foreign Office Summer School on, guess what, the evils of communism. And it was decided that as part of his career, he needed to go abroad. And he was sent to Washington, where they were developing, this is during the Korean War, developing their Far Eastern department. And he goes to live at this house in Nebraska Avenue, owned by his old friend Kim Philby, who by this stage is the MI6 head of station and CIA liaison officer in Washington. Philby lives in the middle of the house. In the attic up the top lives a woman called Esther Whitfield, who is Philby's mistress and secretary. And in the basement here at the back is Burgess. And the reason that Burgess went to live with him was partly so Philby could keep an eye on him, but also because Philby needed a courier. He was serviced by the Russians from New York, and a slightly more junior diplomat, like Burgess, had much more frequent movement to be able to act as his courier. This is Esther Whitfield, I think a rather fascinating character, in that she's a lover not just of one Cambridge spy, but two. She fell in love with Guy Burgess. He actually proposed to her in May 1951, and he fled to Russia before she could give her her answer. But they remained very good friends, and when in Moscow he sent his last will and testament, it was to Esther Whitfield he sent it. She was one of the 4 beneficiaries of his will, the others being Anthony Blunt, Kim Philby, and his boyfriend in Moscow, a man called Tolya. So she's a very interesting figure. She lost her job in 1951 when Philby McLean fled. The suggestion was that she had revealed details of the investigation to McLean to Burgess, which was not true. She never married. She actually spent the rest of her life trying to find some sort of career and some sort of life, really. And she went to Rhodesia, she went to Spain, and is rather a sort of sad figure. This is a man I discovered in the course of my research was a Russian spy, probably the only one who didn't go to Cambridge. He was at Imperial. A man called Wilfred Mann, known as Basil, who was actually discovered by the British and the Americans, turned and played back against the Russians. And he died a few years ago, but he was a colleague of Burgess's down the hall in the embassy. Burgess, by this time, was pretty much cracking up. He was aware that the net was closing in. The defectors were appearing, saying that there was a spy in the Foreign Office who'd been at Eton. Now that didn't really limit things much, because most of the people in the Foreign Office had been at Eton. But there were also suggestions that code traffic was being broken. There was something called Venona code traffic, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the spies were rumbled. He was drinking very heavily, he was taking drugs. He got his drugs off a friend of his who was a vet who specialised in horses, and so never quite got the dosage right, and he was in a pretty bad way. And in America, no one really quite knew what to do with him. He was moved from the Forest Department to the Middle East Department to a roving commission, which was to pick up on American public opinion, which required him to sit in bars all day and talk, which is what he quite liked doing. Now, one of his jobs was to go and talk to various groups outside the embassy, and in February 1951, he was sent to talk to a military academy in Charleston about China. And he decided he loved cars. This is the sort of car he drove in Washington, a Lincoln convertible. He decided that he would drive down there. When he went to America, he was given a piece of advice. He was told not to get involved with the color question, not to get involved with communists, and not to get involved with gays. So what does he do? He picks up a black homosexual communist hitchhiker on his way down. They're arrested 3 times in one day in one state for speeding. The first time he tries to proposition the burly patrolman. The second time, when he's been told he's been going at 80 miles an hour, he remonstrates with the man, says that's ridiculous, I was doing at least 100. And the third time he threatens to report the patrolman to the governor. I'm afraid the patrolman gets there first, and Burgess is recalled, or seen by the ambassador. He's recalled to Britain. But the timing on this is extremely good, because the Venona code traffic has been broken. In April 1951, they identify a spy in the British Embassy in Washington called Homer. And they know that Homer's wife has gone up to have a baby in New York, and that means only one person, Donald McLean. And so they realize they need to get word of this to Donald McLean. Now, Donald McLean actually has had nothing to do with Burgess since they left Cambridge. He's been posted in Paris. He then goes off to Cairo, where he has a nervous breakdown and smashes up the room of the secretary. He then spends 6 months in a psychiatric hospital, and immediately after that is made head of the American department, and is therefore Burgess's boss. So Burgess, on his way back to Britain, of course, there's no reason why he shouldn't go and see his boss, and so he goes to see Donald McLean. And they put into plan their exfiltration plan. They know from the tip-offs that they've had, because of course the first person to learn about the breaking of the Venona decrypt is Kim Philby, as the CIA liaison officer. They know that the investigations into McLean and interviews are going to take place probably on Monday the 28th of May. And so on the Friday, 25th of May, which is the 38th birthday of Donald McLean, Burgess goes down to the McLean house here, which is just outside Rootham in Kent, to pick him up as part of their journey to Moscow. Now there's some question about why was Burgess used as the escort to take McLean out. Because of course it threw suspicion on Burgess, who hadn't actually been rumbled, and of course it eventually led to suspicions against Philby. And I think the reason that I was given by a KGB officer was they didn't basically care. They had plenty of other people in place. They didn't really care about these burnt-up agents. So Burgess escorts McLean across the Channel. They catch a steamer to Saint-Malo, and then catch a train to Paris, from there to Bern and to Prague. And again, the two theories about whether Burgess felt he was going into exile permanently, or whether he was only escorting McLean part of the way and would come home. The other interesting thing about the whole story is they flee, this is say on Friday the 25th of May. According to the official version, the British government only discovered this when Maclean fails to turn up for work on the following Monday. But I have evidence in the book from two people that the British government knew on the Friday night that they had left. The officers at Southampton, because of course Maclean was under surveillance, reported back to MI5 headquarters at Leconfield House to a man called Russell Lee, who was the personal assistant to the head of MI5 at the time, Percy Sillitoe, that they'd gone. And in fact, Dick White, the man we saw a picture of, was deputed to go after them and discovered that his passport was out of date and he couldn't go. The other bit of evidence is on the Saturday. I talked to a woman called Jane Portal, now Lady Williams, the mother of Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who then was working for Winston Churchill at Chartwell. And she says at 7 o'clock on the Saturday, there was a call from the duty officer at the Foreign Office to say your neighbour has flown. Chartwell and the house in Westerham are a few miles apart. So that's an interesting question. The other interesting question is, though they fled, let's say, assuming that they're right, the establishment only knew on the Monday, nothing was done until the story broke at the press on the 7th of June after a press leak from the police in Paris. So this is the boyfriend of Burgess at the time, a man called Jack Hewitt, lover of a whole series of people, including Anthony Blunt and Christopher Isherwood. They sort of, what was nice, they all sort of kept to themselves. This is just a part of Burgess's flat. He was very patriotic. He always decorated his flats in red, white and blue. This is the wanted notices that went out 2 weeks after they arrived in Moscow. I love the description of Burgess. You may say at the bottom it says slightly pigeon-toed. This is the poor bemused German border guard who's looking at this notice 2 weeks after they got to Moscow. And this is the water diviner who was brought in to explain where they'd gone. He said they were south of Paris. This is Percy Sillitoe, the head of MI5, who was had to go and explain to the Americans why all these British agents kept disappearing with American secrets. And basically they disappeared from 1951 right through to 1956. And it was only because Khrushchev was coming on a visit to London that the Russians felt they needed to clear the air, and they were paraded at a press conference in February 1956. And one of Burgess's friends, a man called Trond Dreiberg, who was a Labour MP, came out to see him and asked if he could write his biography. And this is the biography that came out in 1956. This is him in Moscow with Burgess when he came to correct the proofs. And what had appeared, what had happened, is that Burgess and Maclean had been sent off to a closed city on the Volga called Kubyshev. There they had actually lived pretty much under house arrest until probably 1955 and 1956, when they were allowed to come to Moscow. Burgess was given a dacha. This is him here with his dog, known as Joe, after Stalin. And this is the block of flats he had overlooking the Novodevichy monastery in Moscow. One of the things I say in the book, or thought in the book, was that he'd found religion because he spent a lot of time in the monastery. I discovered only recently the reason he spent his time there was he'd fallen in love with a 6-foot Russian priest. So it shows you must never draw any conclusions without evidence. One of the amazing things is that Burgess realised that the British authorities couldn't do anything. They had no evidence to charge him in a court. The Vonono decrypts were secret. He hadn't been caught committing an offence. He hadn't confessed to anything. And he would chide the British. He would keep threatening to come home and say there's nothing you can do about it. And they were very, very worried about this. Burgess recreated basically his rooms at Cambridge in Moscow. He had his furniture shipped out, his books, pictures. He was visited by a whole series of people, from Graham Greene to Stephen Spender. This is his old mum coming out to see him. He ostensibly had a job advising a publishing house there, but his real job was to advise the Russian Foreign Ministry on British politics and personalities, and of course he knew them all from his days in broadcasting, the Week at Westminster. This is a picnic on the Moscow River with a woman called Mary Fedden, quite a well-known artist, married to Julian Trevelyan. And he spent quite a lot of time just relaxing at Black Sea resorts, and here he is at some of these Black Sea resorts. It was a pretty lonely existence. The picture we get in English and Abroad from Coral Browne is pretty accurate, and I have a chapter in the book basically looking at that episode. And he hung around the Bolshoi, Western hotels, anything to try and make contact with people there. He was drinking very heavily. He had heart disease that he inherited from his father. He had diabetes. And in August 1963, he died at the age of 52. This is a picture of his funeral. The man in the middle is his younger brother, Nigel. Nigel told me a good story. He said that when he flew out to go to the funeral, and of course the death of Burgess had made front page news around the world, the woman at Thomas Cook paused for a moment when she heard the name Burgess, and she said to him, "Sir, will that be a single or a return?" This is the funeral with Nigel, Melinda McLean, who by 1955 had come out to join her husband. Natalia, the woman crying, is Burgess's housekeeper, and then Donald McLean is there as well. Burgess had a boyfriend in Moscow called Tolia, who was provided for him by the KGB. His main job was just to inform on Burgess, and he would keep an eye on him. Tolia disappeared. As soon as Burgess died, that was the last thing he was seen of poor Tolia. And this is Burgess's wingback armchair, which he left to Kim Philby. This is actually Rufina Philby's flat. Burgess left nothing to Don McLean. He left his books and his most of his furniture and his clothes to Philby, who by 1963 had also come to Moscow. Philby discovered that most of the books were library books and heavily annotated. And Nigel then returned from the funeral with his brother's ashes, and in October 1963, at dead of night, under great secrecy, Burgess finally had his wish and was reunited, brought back to Britain, and buried in the family plot here in Westmead. So that is the story of Stalin's Englishman. I think I discovered not only the most interesting of the Cambridge Five, I think a man with a huge hinterland, friends that range from Lucian Freud and Frederick Ashton to George Orwell and Laurence Olivier. But also I discovered, and I didn't set out to do this, the most important of the Cambridge spies, according to the Russians. He was, according to them, the moral leader of the group. He was the man who was the most effective. He was the first to penetrate British intelligence, the only one to serve in both MI5 and MI6, had this crucial role after the war in the Foreign Office, but also as an agent of influence, the BBC, in the Forest Department, and later shaping policy when he was in Moscow. And of course he had this very important role for them as his courier just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And I think the other question, or two questions people ask, is how did he get away with it, and why did he do it? And I almost call this book The 9 Lives of Guy Burgess, because he was just very lucky. He was incredibly charming and intelligent and manipulative and devious, and was able to survive all sorts of things that other people wouldn't have survived. There were disciplinary panels sometimes where he survived by vote 5-4, not to do with his spying, but to do with his just general attitude to work. And I think one of the reasons he survived was the Foreign Office was then a pretty tolerant place, and probably is now too. There's a story told of him coming down one of these four-power conferences wearing lipstick one morning, and someone being slightly appalled, and Alec Cadogan saying, "Well, we tolerate eccentricity in the Foreign Office." I think that that was, he had these very strong mentors who saved him. And why did he do it? Well, I think he was drawn to Marxism, like many people in the 1930s, because he felt it was the only way to stand up to fascism. But that doesn't really explain why he became an agent or why he stuck the course. Many people, of course, dropped out during the war, or 1960, during Czechoslovakia or Budapest, or any of these moments. And I think the reason is that once he picked his football team, he felt he had to stick with it. He had no choice. He was in too deep. But I think also he just loved the sense of power it gave him, this petit la bourgeoisie, as Stephen Runciman described it as. He loved the sense of riding with the hares and the hound, and the fact that he led this double life. And as a biographer, I think this is what intrigued me about him, the whole series of lives that he led, both as a spy for the British and the Russians, but also as a very, I think, highly regarded Foreign Office official. So I hope that hasn't been too long, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Do you think he was always an alcoholic, or did he take to drink because of the stress of the situation?
The question is, did he take to drink? Well, he drank very heavily from a very early age. So I think it got worse, and they all were drinking heavily. I mean, Blunt and Philby and McLean were all often being terribly indiscreet. I mean, they would go up to people and say, "I'm a communist agent," and people would laugh and say, "Yes, you are, of course you are." So yes, I mean, he was, and they were all beginning to take drugs. both McLean and Philby, when they got to Moscow, tried to commit suicide. I mean, they were pretty burnt-out cases, and you can see why the Russians basically were keen to get them back. I think the interesting question is why Philby was allowed to escape, why people like John Cairncross and Blunt were given immunity and never prosecuted. And I think it's because it would have been too embarrassing.
Excuse me, have we kept those conferences on the evils of communism?
Yes, the Foreign Office Summer School at Worcester College, he would lecture on the evils of communism.
And do we have any of them in writing?
No, alas not. No. I mean, alas, we don't have speeches. We just have people sitting there saying how persuasive he was.
Oh.
Question at the back, yeah.
Hi, Andrew. I'm interested to know what compelled you to write this.
What compelled me to write the book? Well, I helped someone write a book on Anthony Blunt in 1985. And at that time, pretty every week, the Sunday Times had a new Cambridge spy being discovered. And it was a very exciting time. And I interviewed a lot of these people, so Michael Straight and Nigel Burgess and others. And I had this material, and I went off and did other things, or I had a career and did books. But I always wanted to come back to doing Burgess. And having collected these interviews with all these people, I suddenly discovered that files were beginning to be released, though tragically, the British decided to release the files 2 weeks after my book came out. I can say that adds absolutely nothing to the picture. When I had to do the paperback and update it, there was very little to update. But that's why. And I was just drawn to him because he seemed such a such a contradictory and complex character, and someone that therefore I felt was quite interesting for a biographer. The man at the back.
Do you like him?
Yes, I did. I did like him. I mean, I think I would probably have had him to dinner, but not put my nephew sitting next to him. But yeah, I found him a rather tragic figure. But he was clearly very charming, and lots of very important people, respected him and liked him. But I mean, he could be pretty devious and ruthless, and he was clearly pretty grubby and pretty promiscuous. He claimed he could charm anyone, and I suspect that's right. I mean, he must have had hundreds of lovers. He liked particularly lorry drivers for some reason, but he was a wonderful breath of fresh air in some ways because he didn't care a damn really. So yeah, and I think you can't write a book about someone unless you feel some sort of empathy towards him. Yeah. Well, I mean, he was drawn to communism through his study of history. He was a Marxist historian, and he was very involved. He was very involved in the CUSS. He always made a distinction between British communists, who he liked, and Russian communists, who he didn't like. So I think it was a pick and mix sort of thing, but he was clearly very knowledgeable about communist history. And I think he did, even though he was a member of all the smartest clubs, he still believed in the redistribution of wealth and all those things. But I think in the end, that it was a personal thing rather than a political thing for him.
And that was no impediment whatsoever to enjoying the book?
No, well, a lot of people clearly, I think that was one of the strengths. People felt that he understood communism because he had been a communist. There are others who had no idea he was a communist, to be fair. I mean, he didn't broadcast it. And for everyone who saw him drunk, and there were plenty of others who saw him as a very serious civil servant. People who worked with him had no idea of his political views or his sexuality. So he was very good about compartmentalizing his life. Yeah.
So I can ask two questions while I'm coming back. One is, you said he was constantly getting engaged. Did he ever have any heterosexual relationships?
Yes, he did.
Actual? And the other question was his brother Nigel's life blighted by the fact he was his brother?
Well, I mean, Burgess had a whole series of relationships with women. I mean, I out him as a bisexual in the book, including with Clarissa Churchill and with Esther Whitfield. But there was another woman, a woman called Margarita Segredo. Yeah, so a whole series of women. I mean, and they were all. I mean, Blunt had relationships with women. I mean, though McLean was married, he was gay. The only one who was resolutely heterosexual was Philby. And Nigel really had very little to do with his brother. Though he went to Locust Park and Eton and Trinity, he was an extremely good musician. He was in Footlights at Cambridge, and he worked briefly in MI5 during the war alongside his brother. But then at the end of the war, there were no jobs in MI5, and he went into advertising. And those of you may remember the PG Tip adverts with the chimps. That is Nigel Burgess's contribution to British culture. But when I talked to him, he was fond of his brother, but they were they really had very little to do with each other.
Is he still alive?
No, Nigel died a few years ago, but the sons, both the sons are alive and were very helpful. And all these pictures, family pictures, come from them, and the last will and testament comes from them. So, and they've showed me, I mean, he taught them how to draw, and they have rather amusing stories of him. He was very good with children. He had lots and lots of godchildren. He was very good with them, because he was sort of a child himself, sort of a Peter Pan figure. Yeah. So, just there.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, it's more about you than Burgess. I just wondered whether you found it at all daunting writing a book on a subject that has already had so much written about it.
Well, daunting in some ways. There have been lots of books on the Cambridge Spies, but this is the first proper book on Burgess, interestingly enough. And it was very, I thought there would be very difficult to find material because nothing had much been written about him in the past, funny enough. I mean, lots on Philby Maclean, but if you read those books, there's very little on Burgess. But actually, by just doing basic investigative journalistic work, so finding out who he was at school with and at university, I wrote to the Army Navy Club and got people who'd been in the Navy with or in the Dartmouth with him at the same time. I found about these 100 people, and funny enough, often things happen by word of mouth. Someone else put me on to someone else. I traced his boyfriend in Tangier and went to see him. He gave me say, I think in your room he said there's some cartoons by Guy. I looked at them and said, they're not by Guy. And he said, oh, they must be the Francis Bacon ones then. And Francis Bacon had been one of his lodgers, and eventually ended up in the Tate. I went off and saw KGB officers in the 1990s, because of course Glasnost, they were quite happy to talk, and got stuff there that perhaps wouldn't have been available before. And gradually, there have been files released, and under Freedom of Information I've had some files released to build the picture. So it was daunting, because that's why it took so long. But actually, funny enough, the material was there. Sorry.
Is it quantifiable how many people he actually caused to lose their lives?
No, it's very difficult to do an audit on his treachery. I mean, there are claims, for example, with Philby, with the Albanian expeditions, that we know how many agents were betrayed and how many died. You can't do that with Burgess. I mean, he was much more the big picture. I mean, clearly American servicemen died in Korea because of what he gave the Russians and the Chinese. But it's very difficult to know what was betrayed. The view was taken in 1951 that everything across his desk had been compromised. And so a lot of operations, a lot of people had been caught. But it's very difficult to do a causal link. And the other irony of the whole story is that the Russians couldn't believe that he had access to such good material. And they didn't believe it. They thought he must be a double agent. And so a lot of the stuff was ignored. And when some of the files were opened in the 1980s in Moscow, they discovered they'd never actually been translated. But no, really difficult. I tried at the end of the book to do an audit of treachery, but it's really difficult to do that. Yeah?
I sort of have two as well, feed into each other. The first, when I was listening to some of the details, aside from obviously the homosexuality, but if you sub that with heterosexuality, and if you sub communism with capitalism, there's a lot of the James Bond prototype, and I'm wondering, did he ever cross paths with Ian Fleming, especially considering as one of the themes that people cite as one of the bad things about a Bond novel is Bond frequently identifies his opposite number as so-and-so as a homosexual, and that's one of the, Bond with his extreme, was perhaps Bond and some of the stuff that was written kind of almost a propaganda tool against this sort of underscore of, the gay and...
I've not come across any evidence that he ever met Fleming at all. And of course, Fleming clearly was writing in this environment. The Bond books start just after Burgess flees to Moscow. But I think they're part of a more general account of what was happening in the Cold War. But it's certainly Le Carre uses Burgess Maclean and the whole story of Phil particularly in a lot of his books.
Yeah, and even the later ones, because Taylor of Panama is about feeding fake intelligence because you're a bit of a chancer, but you'll trust it, so a similar thing happening.
Yeah, that's a pretty standard operating procedure in intelligence. But interesting. Burgess does appear in about 200 novels, and including 2 or 3 that's just come out this year. So he's clearly a figure that's drawn on quite a lot of plays. Apart from Another Country and English from Abroad, there's a whole series about Robin Chapman, which I list as a little appendix in the book of Burgess and literature.
And the second is about the architecture of the network that he set up. For example, if you take it to its extremes, you flash forward 30 years, you take it to the 1980s, flash forward another 30 years, this recurring theme of the BBC being a potential tool of the left wing, and that being a problem to strategic defence. In the 80s, apparently, we're led to believe that even Doctor Who was apparently being used as a tool to sabotage the Thatcher regime, and even now with the idea of privatisation and there being this block of well-established, ingrained artists against it, who have money and power but are nevertheless left-wing. I'm wondering, is there any possibility that he was in effect a really what you're indicating is that he was a really long-term thinker, to the extent that that's maybe why he didn't care about what happened in the short term. He knew that what they were building was a lifelong project that could go on to the next generation.
Well, we know there are many agents who we never discovered, and I've mentioned some of the names. I mean, the Russians tend to number the recruits by the moment they're recruited, and though Burgess and Maclean were recruited within about a month, there's about a gap of 10 between the two. So there are plenty of other people who recruited, we don't know what happened to them. I mean, MI5 have an officer in the BBC who vets what goes on in the BBC. I mean, one of the ironies of this whole story, it's filled with ironies, is that Burgess was responsible in the BBC for vetting people for being left-wing. He was a trusted man to George Barnes, director of television, or director of radio at the time, to find subversives in the BBC.
And they still have that officer in the BBC?
Yes, yeah, they still have that officer.
That's remarkable. Right. Thank you.
Yep.
I don't know if you saw an article in the Weekend Financial Times shortly after your book came out, praising your book.
Oh, nice. I didn't see it, no.
One Simon Cooper, and the title is From Cambridge Spies to ISIS Jihadists. And he, in this article, looks at many parallels, sees many parallels.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
Abdus Salam, chap behind the Paris terrorism attacks, and Burgess.
A very interesting analogy, absolutely. I think this is why it's still current. I mean, there's still sleepers being sent in, there's still this fanaticism, there's still people in the community who feel are loyal to one country and are actually not. But this is the thing going right back. I mean, John Buchan, of course, in 39 Steps, that's what he has at the end of 39 Steps. But I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, there's this series in America, The Americans, with these long-term sleepers who've been planted there by the Russians. So it hasn't gone away. But I think, coming back to your question, I think there are lots and lots of spies clearly who were never caught. I'm pretty sure were never caught, and clearly they may well have recruited other people. So the whole thing may have continued. But I think what made it very attractive to the Russians at the time was that moment when it was people were much more susceptible to being recruited on terms of ideology rather than the other things, which tend to be compromise, money, and ego. We call it mice.
It's rather worrying, really, that nothing continues.
Absolutely, no, absolutely, and I think it has. And I think the other thing that I find fascinating is that there was a big cover-up by the Foreign Office afterwards. They didn't. There was something called a white paper. Was called a whitewash paper. They didn't come clean on what had happened and how important Burgess and Maclean had actually really been, and that's gone on the whole way. I mean, I think I was shocked to discover, as historians, we have a Public Records Act and we have a Freedom of Information Act, and the government do not adhere to either of them. They do not we now have a 20-year rule where all documents have to be placed in the archives, and they're not. They're held back. And there's no public interest defence. They can decide on their own grounds what they want to keep back. And in fact, the Foreign Office got so cross with me asking for freedom of information requests that they banned me from putting in more than one every 3 months. So I created a whole series of alter egos, including Robert Burgess, and sent in. And then I was told I was vexatious. They said it was too expensive to deal with these requests because it would cost them about £100. I've now got a case against the Information Commission and the First Tier Tribunal where they bring in QCs at £300 an hour to defend the fact that they're not releasing these documents. But I mean, only 85 documents were in the Public Record Office at Christmas. Yes, man in the green shirt.
Okay, sorry. Are you aware of a tape that surfaced in the Stasi records? I think it's Burgess.
Yes, there was a tape came out a few weeks ago of Philby lecturing a Stasi group.
Is it?
Yeah, it's Philby lecturing in East Germany, a group of Stasi agents. What happened to poor old Philby? Philby Maclean died in the 1980s, and Philby went in January 1963, and he was treated just as an agent. They were all treated as just simple agents. They were made sure. I mean, the line with Burgess was his needs were met, but that was it. And Philby was very unhappy. He wasn't getting the respect that he wanted. And then a group of young KGB officers in the 1990s realised there was a huge asset here, and they should, he became a bit of a hero. And he used to go and lecture at the KGB training school, and we have one actual tape of that, which has been around for a long time. And this is another one that he only went to East Germany once, but this is the tape that came up and was found in Stasi files the other day by Gordon Carrera. and it has Philby lecturing. I think the extraordinary thing, and you can Google both that tape and actually an interview with Burgess that he did with Canadian television. And the extraordinary thing is the very clipped upper class way they spoke, even after they'd been in Russia for a dozen years. Yeah.
Compare Assange, Manning and Snowden.
Compare Assange, Manning and Snowden.
Back to,
Well, I mean, they're whistleblowers. I mean, and they've been very damaging. And they would argue that they're idealists like Guy Burgess, but they're no different. And you know, they will have to pay the cost.
it seems to me they blast a lot of information all at once and then run. Whereas Burgess was over a long period.
Yeah, he was a long-term penetration agent and he was recruited, but I think there's some suggestion that Snowden was also recruited. I mean, why does Snowden sitting in Moscow, why is he giving stuff to the Chinese? So I think the extraordinary thing here is just how poor security still is, that a low-level person like Manning could still have access to this important information, which meant they had to roll up operations that had been going for years and bring in people and play agents in place. So I think it's terrible. I'm not a supporter of any of those three.
Do you think that this, you're sort of alluding to this cover-up of the establishment, is that because of the people themselves, or just because of the system that they're trying to cover up?
I think the cover-up is for two reasons. One is it's just this default position. I've been told this. Default position for freedom of information requests is to say no. It's easier to say no than to say yes and release things. You never quite know once you've released it how the whole pattern may pull together. I think also there's a lot of embarrassing information that they don't want out. The fact that they didn't do anything quickly, the fact that they were pretty useless, the fact they hadn't caught them. I mean, they had extensive files on MI5 on people, but just the wrong people. And I think it's just there is a culture of secrecy in Whitehall, and it's very detrimental to history because you cannot write history accurately if you don't have the records. Sorry, down here. Yeah. Sorry, somebody has another question for then the other green shirt.
Just wondering if you had any complaints or any requests from either the Home Office or the family not to include anything.
No, the family were very. There was nothing that they were intrigued to find out. They were quite young. They were born in during the war, the nephews, and so they never really knew him. They were quite young. Absolutely no pressure on me whatsoever. I mean, they're highly sophisticated people, and they see us as another generation. The government. I mean, apart from making life difficult for me in terms of getting access to information, I've not had any problems. There was one person, there's a picture I showed there of someone who Burgess approached and in MI5 who was not recruited, turned it down but didn't report him. And because I didn't have proof of that, I'd only had it as word of mouth from someone, and because I wanted to use the photograph for my book, I didn't put that. But so far, no, there've been absolutely nothing. I mean, to remember, this is 70 years ago this all happened. Yes, Lisa.
Another, sort of family question. I noticed from your photograph that his mother lived at him when he fled to Moscow. I mean, I find it very strange. I mean, I know, having read Virginia Woolf's diary, that Vanessa Bell, Virginia herself, were absolutely horrified when Julian Bell, which she pointed out was one of his close friends at Cambridge, didn't even tell his mother that he was going to join the International Brigade, and didn't know until he got to Marseille that he was on his way to Spain. And they were devastated. But what about Burgess's mother, who then visited him?
Well, I mean, the extraordinary thing is that she was due to see, he saw his mother every Sunday, and he was due to see his mother on the Sunday when he fled, just before he fled, and he didn't tell her. And she didn't know what was going on for some time. I mean, there were rumours that he'd been killed, he died. The Foreign Office then decided to tell her that in fact they knew where he was and he was fine and not to worry, but wouldn't give her any more information. It was only when she got a letter a couple of years later that she knew he was still alive. And that was the main reason he wanted to come back was to Britain, just for visits, was to see his old mum. But it's fascinating that the correspondence with his mother was thrown into his grave when he died. I thought that's very annoying. And then discovered that MI5 had intercepted all the letters. So you can read the whole correspondence, but it's a weird relationship. It was almost a lover's relationship. It's really Oedipal and really odd.
So she forgave him, really?
Sorry?
She forgave
Well, she said it was good for him to go to Moscow. The discipline was good for him, and she sent him hampers from Fortnum and Mason and every month. Sorry, another question at the man in the middle.
What are you working on at the moment?
I'm doing another book about a charming rogue called Lord Mountbatten. It's a joint portrait of him and his wife. So, lady in the pink and white. So red and white.
Do we know, or is there any evidence as to, was he happy in Moscow afterwards, or did he regret what he'd done?
He never said he regretted anything. At least no one's ever reported that. But no, he was desperately unhappy. He was very lonely, and he did miss. I mean, the things that he really loved were the Reform Club and picking up men at the top of Piccadilly tube steps and things like that, reading Jane Austen. And none of those things were available to him. It was a pretty grim place, Moscow in the 1950s. He had his teeth knocked out. He was mugged one day. He was under curfew until 4 o'clock every day. The food there was pretty awful, and you get a sense of that from the Alan Bennett play. But no, he never expressed regret. It's extraordinary. And in some ways, that's why one has to have a sort of grudging respect for him, because he felt that he'd made the right decision to his own cost. Yeah.
Do you think a lot of this is just in his head an outrageous game? He was just playing an outrageous game. He was a middle class, upper class who had a lot of money, and he was just alleviating his boredom. He was obviously in with the big gay scene, and he was just having a lark.
Well, it was a pretty serious thing. I mean, he was
but on a massive scale.
I think he was very committed to the Russians, and they took him very seriously. And the fact that he was taking all these documents out at great risk, quite difficult to do, and living. I mean, for 15 years he worked undercover as a Russian agent. That's quite a commitment. I think it's more than a game.
But
well, they call it the great game.
And a heavy drinker, into sex heavily, and he was just having a lark, I think.
Well, he was a man of great appetite, certainly. Yeah, I think there's certainly, there's some suggestions a bit like people who shoplift, you don't need to. It was the adrenaline buzz. I think absolutely that was part of it.
That's right.
He enjoyed the seat.
He seemed to be a very narcissistic person.
Yes, absolutely. And I did ask a psychiatrist to do an appendix, to do an exam, read the book, and to give me a view about that. And they said that he had this narcissistic personality. Absolutely. Sorry.
I have to ask this, did you ever learn to speak Russian?
No, pidgin Russian. Donald MacLean was a goody-goody and learned it properly, but no, he never did. So he could never really properly communicate either with his housekeeper or with Tolia. So no, he wasn't that keen on Russia, but he was very keen on the history and the music. He claimed that Tolia was an illegitimate son, a grandson of Tolstoy. He liked to claim this bedhead came from Stendhal and this dinner service came from someone else. So he loved, he was very into Shostakovich and he was very musical, but it was the culture rather than more than the language. It's odd because he was a good linguist. He spoke very good French, for example. So it was a bit of a block on him. Sorry, right up there.
Right. I put it to you that Burgess didn't come back, not because he didn't want to come back, but he was still playing the British MI5 and MI6 at the same time, because he knew far much more than they knew, or they wanted.
Well, I think the Russians didn't want him to go because clearly he knew what was going on in Russia now, and the British didn't want him to come back. In fact, his passport went out of date quite quickly and wasn't renewed, and he was under surveillance all the time. There was no way he could have come back. And though there's anguished correspondence in government papers about what they could do if somehow he does try and come back, there were some rumours in April '62 that both he and Maclean were going to land at Prestwick on their way back from Cuba. And they did there was a very official, in coordination with the press, Chapman Pincher was often used to these things, the line was put that he'd be arrested as soon as he appeared on British soil, but in fact he was never coming to Britain anyway. So I don't think so. There's some suggestions that Philby was turned as an agent and was played back against the Russians. I think that's very unlikely that happened, except in the sense that perhaps the British authorities knew about Philby's treachery so certainly knew from 51 onwards, and that they fed in false information which to pass back to the Russians from 51 to 63. That's certainly a possibility.
Who cracked the codes that exposed them?
It was a man called Meredith Gardner, who's only just died.
UK or America?
In America. And they're still they're still deciphering the phonome traffic now. They're still, I mean, it's a slow process, but they're still finding things. So we may find some more information. The other place where we're getting information is something called the Matrokin Archive, which was there was a KGB archivist called Matrokin who squirreled away all the papers that came across his desk and was eventually exfiltrated from Russia a few years ago. And that material now is at Churchill College, Cambridge, though quite a lot of it is still secret. So we're beginning to get a bit of a picture, but it was a huge operation the Russians did right across Europe, and particularly actually strong in France. I should say that a lot of the activities that went on in Paris, it was all run from Paris, and that's why Burgess's contact with Edward Pfeiffer was very, very useful.
Excuse me, being a French woman here, did they use the same technique to get French intellectuals to get to Moscow? So the French code group of the gay community, highly educated?
Yes, they didn't tend to penetrate the universities in the same way, but they certainly recruited them, and people like Edward Pfeiffer were recruited. There were quite a lot of people who were recruited absolutely at this time to work by a man called Willy Munzenberg in Paris. But absolutely, and I think this comes out, there's a whole book, I think, on Matrokin in France. I mean, it's a big operation.
Excuse me, how do they recruit women then?
Well, there were, funny enough, the Russians were much more equal opportunity employers. And so there were quite a lot of Russian spies. There's one called Sonia, who was operating outside Oxford for them, and there's quite a well-known spy called Benita Norwood. Not recruited at Cambridge, because clearly there were very few women who were at Cambridge at the time, but they used women a lot, and they used them often as pairs, so they would come as a husband and wife team as illegals. But I'm not aware of anyone being recruited through the Oxford-Cambridge rings did not have women in them, except if we take on board that possibly Teth Rothschild was a spy, as a lot of people think. Great, well thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank Andrew for taking time out of his personal, very busy schedule to come and talk to us. It's really kind. Thank you very much. Still books for sale if anyone would like a copy, and book signing afterwards. Thank you. Thank you.